The morning my life changed started like any other morning in Sheffield. Grey sky, wet pavement. The smell of rain on old brick that never quite leaves this city, no matter how much glass and steel they bolt onto the skyline. My name is Thomas Whitaker, 54 years old, floor supervisor at Brindle and Sons Manufacturing for the last 26 years. My father worked the same factory before me. My grandfather worked the steel mills that used to stand where the new conference center now stands. 3 generations of us, all within half a mile of the same patch of Yorkshire dirt. I was wearing the suit my wife Karen had pulled out of the back of the wardrobe the night before. Navy blue, a bit tight around the shoulders now. The last time I'd worn, it was my daughter's graduation 4 years ago. "You look smart," Karen had said, brushing something off the lapel. "I feel daft. You're meeting a prince. Thomas, wear the suit." So I wore the suit. The building they'd chosen for the round table was something else. The old Templeborough steel mill, where my grandfather had spent 41 years of his life, had been gutted and rebuilt into what they called a heritage innovation hub. Glass walls, polished concrete floors. The original brick chimneys preserved as decoration, like teeth from an animal that had been killed and stuffed. I stood outside for a moment before going in, just looking up at it, trying to feel my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, the way I used to when he'd bring me here as a boy before the mill closed in 1993. Thomas Whitaker, a young woman with a clipboard, smart blazer, headset. "That's me. Lovely you're on the workers panel. If you'd like to follow me." She led me through a lobby full of people I didn't recognize. Men in suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage. Women carrying leather folders. Everyone holding coffee cups with the same logo on them. Everyone checking phones. But scattered among them were people I did recognize. Or at least, people who looked like me, workers. You can always tell not by the clothes, most of us had made an effort, but by the way we stood. A bit too still. A bit too aware of our own hands. I spotted Margaret Hollis near the window, 61 years old. She'd worked the line at Brindle's for 38 years. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, and she'd told me once, over a cup of tea in the canteen, that the factory was the only place that still felt like family. "Tom," she nodded at me. "Look at you in a suit. Look at you in heels. Don't," she winced. "My feet are killing me already, and we've not even sat down." There was a young lad next to her, skinny, couldn't have been more than 19, brown skin, nervous eyes. He kept smoothing down his tie like he wasn't sure it was on right. "This is James," Margaret said. "Apprentice. Started 6 months ago. James Okafor." He stuck out his hand, firm shake, looked me in the eye. I liked him immediately. "How you finding it, James?" Honestly, he gave a small laugh. "Terrifying. I didn't even know what a round table was until last week." "Neither did I, son. Neither did I." The woman with the clipboard came back and told us we should make our way through to the main hall. We followed her along a corridor lined with old photographs, black and white pictures of men with suited faces and proud eyes. My grandfather wasn't in any of them, but he could have been. They all looked the same to me. They all looked like family. The main hall was massive. A long oak table ran down the middle of it, surrounded by maybe 30 chairs. There were nameplates at each seat, water glasses, notepads with the royal crest on them, and at the head of the table, one empty chair, bigger than the others. Slightly higher back, I knew whose chair it was. I took my seat about a third of the way down. Margaret was opposite me. James was 2 seats to my left, looking like he might be sick. On my right was an older gentleman in a tweed jacket who introduced himself as Charles Bennett, regional rep for the GMB union. Solid handshake. The kind of man who'd done a lot of negotiating in his time. "You all right, lad?" Charles said quietly. "First time at one of these, first time at anything like this. Just speak honestly. They've not invited us here for decoration." "Whatever they say." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed him. Across the table from us, the other side was filling up. Sharp suits, sharper haircuts. I recognized a couple of faces from the news, a government minister I couldn't name, a woman who I think ran a big consultancy firm in London. And then at the far end, directly opposite where the prince would sit, a man slid into his chair like he owned the place. Tall, lean, silver hair that had probably been styled that morning by someone who charged more than I earned in a week. Watched the size of a small dinner plate. I'd seen him on TV. Marcus Trenton, CEO of some big automation firm. Trenton Robotics, I think. He was always in the business news, talking about the future of work, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He looked around the table once, taking us all in. His gaze passed over me, over Margaret, over James, and didn't stop. We were furniture to him. I'd seen that look 1,000 times in my life. From middle managers, from inspectors, from men who thought a clean fingernail made them better than us. He glanced at his watch. The first time I noticed it, I don't know why, a hush fell over the hall, the double doors at the end opened, and a small group of people walked in. Security, a couple of aides, a press officer, and then him, Prince William. He wasn't what I'd expected. I don't know what I had expected exactly. Something taller, something more guarded. But he walked in like a man walking into his own kitchen. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet, "Good morning, everyone. Please don't get up." Half the room got up anyway. He waved us back down with a small smile and then did something I didn't see coming. He didn't go to his chair. He walked the long way round the table, past the executives, past the ministers, past Marcus Trenton, and came to our side, the workers' side. He stopped at Margaret first. "You must be Mrs. Hollis." Margaret froze, her mouth opened slightly. "Margaret, yes, Your Royal Highness, please. William is fine." He shook her hand gently. "I'm told you've been at Brindle's nearly 4 decades. That's extraordinary. It's just been my life. That's not just anything." He moved to James next, asked him about the apprenticeship. James stammered something about welding. William nodded like it was the most important thing he'd heard all day, and then he came to me. "Mr. Whitaker, sir." He shook my hand, strong grip, calloused even. Not the hand I'd expected. "How's your grandson getting on? Started reception this September, didn't he?" I stared at him. I had not told a single person on the organizing committee about my grandson. Not one. I'd not even told Karen I was going to mention him. He did. "Yeah. How did you?" William smiled, just the smallest smile. "I do my homework." "I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say today, Mr. Whitaker." He moved on. Charles, the next worker. Each one a handshake. Each one a question that suggested he'd actually read about them before he came. I sat back in my chair, my heart hammering. From across the table, Marcus Trenton was watching this performance with an expression somewhere between amusement and impatience. He checked his watch again, the second time. The prince finally took his seat at the head of the table. He poured his own water, didn't wait for an aide to do it, set the glass down quietly and looked around at all of us, taking his time. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His voice was softer than I'd imagined, not weak, just measured, like a man who'd learned that being loud doesn't make you heard. "I want to begin by saying something that might surprise some of you." A small pause. "I don't know the answer to the question we're here to discuss." A few of the executives shifted in their seats. I saw Marcus Trenton's eyebrow lift very slightly. "I've read the reports. I've spoken to economists, business leaders, union representatives, factory workers, and apprentices over the past several months. And what I've come to understand is that the future of work in this country is not a question that gets solved in a boardroom by people who've never operated a lathe." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "So today I'd like to listen, genuinely listen. Before we talk about policy, before we talk about technology, I want to hear from the people in this room whose lives this directly affects. After that, we'll discuss what we can actually do." He gestured with an open hand toward a woman seated 2 down from him. "Dr. Sharma, would you like to begin by giving us the lay of the land?" Dr. Priya Sharma was an economist from one of the universities. Cambridge, I think. She stood and walked to a small screen at the side of the hall and began clicking through slides. Numbers, charts, trend lines. She talked for about 15 minutes about something called labor displacement and structural unemployment and skills gap acceleration. I caught maybe half of it, but the gist was clear enough. Machines are getting better, faster, cheaper. And the kinds of jobs people like me and Margaret had spent our lives doing were on a list that someone somewhere had labeled vulnerable. When she finished, William thanked her quietly and turned his eyes down the table. "Mr. Trenton, I believe you wanted to share some thoughts on the technology side." Marcus Trenton stood. I'll give him this. He knew how to fill a room. He didn't use a screen. He didn't use notes. He just stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and began speaking like he'd been doing it since birth. Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, the numbers Dr. Sharma has just shown us are not predictions. They are inevitabilities. He paused, looked around, let the words sit. Within 10 years, my company alone will deploy automation systems capable of replacing roughly 80% of repetitive manufacturing tasks across the United Kingdom. Welding, assembly, quality inspection, packaging, logistics, tasks that currently employ approximately 2.3 million people. He said it like he was reading the weather. This is not a threat, this is progress. Throughout history, every industrial revolution has displaced workers. The Luddites smashed looms, the horse-drawn carriage industry vanished, coal mines closed. And every single time in the long run, the economy adapted, productivity rose, and a new generation of better jobs emerged. To resist automation is, frankly, to resist mathematics. He smiled, a practiced magazine cover smile. What we need is not protection of dying jobs. What we need is acceptance of the new reality. And the funds currently being spent propping up legacy manufacturing should be redirected toward universal basic income trials, early retirement packages, and a quiet, dignified transition out of these industries for those who frankly are too old to retrain. I felt Margaret go very still across the table from me. Workers will be looked after. Companies like mine are prepared to assist with the transition. But the train is leaving the station. And the kindest thing we can do is help people accept that rather than pretend otherwise. He sat down, looked at his watch, the third time. Charles Bennett, the union rep, looked like he was about to come across the table. His knuckles were white around his pen. Prince William was very still, hands folded on the table in front of him. He waited a long moment after Marcus had sat down. The silence stretched. Then he said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Trenton." He turned to our side of the table, Mrs. Hollis. "You worked at Brindle's the year my mother first visited Sheffield, didn't you?" Margaret blinked. Yes, I was 23. She came to the factory floor. My father told me about that visit. She wrote about it that evening, apparently about how the women on the line had built something extraordinary. May I ask you a question? Of course. You've spent 38 years building things with your hands. If a machine could do your job tomorrow, what do you think would be lost? Margaret opened her mouth. Well, That's a difficult question, William. Marcus Trenton's voice cut across the table, smooth, friendly, sharp as a knife. With respect, sentimentality isn't really data. We have to make decisions based on Mr. Trenton. William didn't raise his voice, but he didn't have to. I asked Mrs. Hollis a question. I'd like to hear her answer, please. The room went silent. Marcus Trenton smiled tightly, sat back, made a small gesture of apology with his hand. Of course, apologies, Mrs. Hollis. Margaret cleared her throat, looked down at her hands for a moment, then up at William. What would be lost, she said slowly, is more than a job. She looked around the table. When I started at Brindle's in 1987, I was 23 years old. My husband had just lost his work at the colliery. We had 2 small children and a mortgage we couldn't afford. The factory gave me something to do. Yes, but it also gave me Doreen, and Sandra, and Pat, and Linda. It gave me a Christmas party where my kids got presents the year we couldn't afford to buy them. It gave me a place to go the week after my husband died, when sitting at home alone would have killed me too. She paused. Her voice didn't waver, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. You can give me money. You can give me a pension. You can give me retraining. But you cannot give me back the women I've spent 38 years standing next to. And if you take my factory away, that goes too. So when you ask me what's lost, that's what's lost, and I just want someone in this room to acknowledge that before they tell me it's progress. The room didn't move. William nodded slowly. Thank you, Margaret. Marcus Trenton checked his watch. 4th time, after Margaret, the room had a different texture, like the air had thickened. You could feel people on the executive side of the table choosing their next words more carefully. The minister tried to step in, a pleasant-faced man in his 50s who said something about how moving everyone's concerns were, and that the government was committed to a balanced approach and supporting both innovation and tradition. It was the kind of speech you could hear at any conference. words shaped into the form of a sentence but not really saying anything. William listened politely, thanked him, then turned back to our side of the table. Mr. Bennett, you've been negotiating on behalf of manufacturing workers for what is it, 22 years now? 24, sir. What's changed in those 24 years? Charles took a deep breath. He was a careful man. You could see him weighing his words. What's changed, sir, is the terms of the conversation. When I started, we negotiated wages, hours, safety conditions. Hard sometimes, but we were arguing about how to share the pie. Now, he looked at Marcus Trenton, then back at William. Now we're arguing about whether the pie exists at all. The conversation isn't how do we pay these workers fairly. The conversation is why do we need these workers at all? And once you've reframed the question that way, no answer the worker gives is the right one. Because the question itself has already decided we're the problem. William wrote something down on his notepad. Actually wrote it, not for show. He was making a note. Marcus Trenton couldn't help himself. Mr. Bennett, with respect, you're describing economic evolution, not a moral failure. Nobody is calling workers the problem. We're. You called us legacy cost, Mr. Trenton. Charles said it quietly. The room went very still. In an interview with the Financial Times. Last March, you used the phrase legacy human cost to describe workers like Mrs. Hollis. I cut it out and kept it in my desk drawer. Would you like me to recite the rest of the paragraph? Marcus Trenton's smile flickered. That was taken out of, it wasn't, sir. Charles wasn't shouting. He was just stating facts. I read the full interview twice. The context made it worse, not better. William looked between them, then said gently, Mr. Trenton, I think Mr. Bennett deserves a proper response. Marcus straightened his shoulders. He was good, I'll say that. He recovered fast. My language in that interview was perhaps clinical. Business journalism encourages a certain bluntness, but the substance of what I said remains true. Older workforces with skills that no longer match market demand do represent, in pure financial terms, a legacy cost. That is not an insult, it is a balance sheet reality. A balance sheet reality, Margaret repeated under her breath. Mr. Trenton, William's voice again, quiet. How old are you? I'm sorry, how old are you? 47. And do you currently work with your hands? I beg your pardon. It's not a trick question. I'm asking whether you currently work with your hands. Do you assemble anything? Build anything? Repair anything? Well, no, obviously not in the literal sense, but so in roughly 20 years' time, when artificial intelligence systems are increasingly capable of replacing executive decision-making, financial analysis, and corporate strategy, which Dr. Sharma's report on page 31 suggests is a real possibility, would you consider yourself at that point a legacy human cost? Marcus Trenton opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That's a different category of why. Because the cognitive work I do requires, Mrs. Hollis has been welding precision components for 38 years. The margin of error she works to is smaller than a human hair. She trained 4 apprentices last year. Is that not cognitive work? The room was utterly silent. I looked at William and realized something. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even raising his voice. He was just asking questions, like a man who had thought about this for a very long time before he ever sat down at this table. Marcus Trenton recovered, but his recovery was slower this time, a beat too long. Your Royal Highness, with respect, I think you may not fully appreciate the business realities at. Mr. Trenton, William reached down beside his chair, picked up a worn leather folder I hadn't noticed before, set it on the table in front of him. I'd like to share something with the table if I may. He opened the folder. Over the past 6 months, I have visited 14 manufacturing facilities across the United Kingdom. Some traditional, some fully automated, some in transition. I went without press. I went without an entourage. In several cases, I went without the senior management, knowing I was on the floor. He paused. One of those facilities was your plant in Manchester, Mr. Trenton. I heard Marcus Trenton breathe in sharply. I spent a full day there. I spoke to 43 of your workers. I have notes from those conversations. I have names. I have specific concerns. I have, for example, the situation of a Mr. Devon Ashworth, whose role as a quality inspector was eliminated last November, who was promised retraining funded by your transition program. and who is currently working night shifts at a petrol station in Salford because the retraining never materialized. The color was going out of Marcus Trenton's face. I have similar accounts from your facilities in Birmingham, in Leeds, and in Glasgow. I have in this folder the names of 211 of your former employees and the details of what happened to them in the 18 months following their, as you say, dignified transition. He closed the folder gently. So when you tell this table that workers will be looked after, I'm asking you in front of these people to explain to Mr. Ashworth and the 210 people behind him what looked after has actually meant in their lives. Marcus Trenton sat there with his mouth slightly open. He didn't check his watch. For the first time that day, he forgot about his watch. It would be wrong of me to say what happened next was satisfying. It wasn't. I'd worked alongside men like Marcus Trenton long enough to know that watching them stumble doesn't fix anything. It just rearranges the pieces for a moment, but it was something to witness. Marcus took a sip of water, a long one, trying to buy time. Your Royal Highness, I appreciate the depth of your research. However, the individual cases you describe, while regrettable, are not representative of 211. Mr. Trenton are not representative of the overall outcomes of the program. We've placed thousands of workers in, have you? I beg your pardon. Have you placed thousands of workers? Or have you funded a third-party retraining provider who has published placement figures that, when independently audited last March, were found to overstate actual employment outcomes by approximately 64%? Silence. Charles Bennett, next to me, was very, very still. The way a man gets still when he realizes he is watching something he didn't think he'd ever see. Mr. Trenton, I am not attacking you. I want that to be clear. I'm attacking an argument. The argument that says the people in this room are inevitable casualties of progress. The argument that decisions about their lives can be made without their voices in the room. The argument that calls them legacy cost and then asks them to nod politely while their pensions are restructured. He opened the folder again. Your company posted record profits last year, £3.8 billion. Your personal compensation package was $47 million. None of that is illegal. None of it is even, in the current system, immoral. But when you sit at this table and tell Mrs. Hollis that the keenest thing we can do is accept her displacement, you are not describing economic inevitability. You are describing a choice that benefits some people and costs others. And if we are going to make that choice as a country, the people paying the cost deserve to be in the room when the choice is made. Marcus Trenton was a different man now. He wasn't slumping. He wasn't visibly defeated. He still had his expensive watch and his expensive suit and his expensive haircut, but the air around him had changed. The other executives weren't looking at him the same way. The minister had shifted his chair half an inch to the left, away from him. Then, to my surprise, Marcus did something I hadn't expected. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and spoke very calmly. Your Royal Highness, with respect, I have given you facts, you have given me anecdotes. I do not deny that the transition has been difficult for some. I do not deny that my company's retraining outcomes have been imperfect, but the alternative you are flirting with, protectionism, subsidy, propping up uncompetitive industries, has been tried by every developed nation on Earth and has failed every time. Britain cannot afford to be a museum. We compete globally or we don't compete at all. He looked around the room. I'm sorry if my honesty has been mistaken for cruelty. It is not, it is realism. And in 20 years, when this country is either thriving in the new economy or left behind by it, history will judge whether the people who pushed for change were the villains or the only adults in the room. He sat down. It was a good speech. I'll give him that. He'd recovered. He wasn't beaten yet. Margaret was looking down at her hands. James Okafor, the apprentice, looked stricken, like the whole thing had collapsed back into a debate he couldn't follow. William let the silence sit. Then he said something I didn't expect. Mr. Trenton, I agree with you. Half the room looked up sharply. I agree that Britain cannot be a museum. I agree that we cannot protect every job through subsidy. I agree that automation is coming and that pretending otherwise is foolish. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not arguing against automation. I'm not arguing against your industry. He turned to us. And I want to say something to the workers at this table, including Mrs. Hollis. I'm not going to stand here and promise you that your jobs will exist in 20 years. I cannot promise that. Anyone who promises that is lying to you. The world is changing, and your jobs as they exist today in many cases, will not survive that change. I felt something tighten in my chest, but he wasn't finished. What I'm going to argue for, however, is the question of who decides what comes next. Whether the future of work in this country is designed in boardrooms in London by people who will not be affected by it, or whether it is built in conversation with the people whose lives it will reshape. He looked back at Marcus. That Mr. Trenton is the difference between you and me. I'm not arguing that change shouldn't happen. I am arguing that the people in this room, Margaret, Thomas, Charles, James, should have a seat at the table when it does. Not as a courtesy, not as a photo opportunity, as partners. He closed his folder, and if your company's model of transition cannot accommodate that, then perhaps your model needs revising. Not their lives. For the first time, I saw something flicker across Marcus Trenton's face that wasn't strategy. It was something more like recognition. He didn't have a response ready. Part 5. The turning point, the mood in the room had changed completely now. It wasn't a debate anymore. It had become something else. A conversation. A real one. The kind I'd only ever had in pub corners with my dad and his old workmates, but never in a room like this. William turned to the apprentice, James. James jumped slightly in his seat. Yes, sir. You've been very quiet today. Will you tell me, in your own words, what your apprenticeship at Brindle's has meant to you? James went red. I felt for the lad. I could see his hands gripping the edge of the table. Well, sir, I don't know if I'm the right person to. You're exactly the right person. You're the future of this. Take your time. James took a breath. I'm 19, sir. I grew up in Burngreave. That's a part of Sheffield where, not a lot of lads my age have options. My dad left when I was 8. My mum works 2 jobs. School wasn't really for me. I left at 16 and worked at a warehouse for 2 years stacking boxes. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't anything. I didn't feel like a person. I felt like a hand that moved boxes. He swallowed. Then 6 months ago, I got into the apprenticeship at Brindle's, and Mr. Whitaker over there, Tom, he was the one who interviewed me. He took a chance on me, and I'm not very good yet. I make mistakes, I burn welds. I dropped a tool last week and broke it, and I thought I'd be fired. He looked at me, half a smile. But Tom didn't fire me. He showed me what I did wrong. He told me his grandfather used to break tools too, and for the first time in my life I feel like I'm becoming something. Like in 20 years I might be the one teaching someone else, and nobody's ever made me feel that before. Not at school, not at the warehouse, just here, in this factory, with these people. He looked at William. So when Mr. Trenton talks about my job not existing in 10 years, I'm not just thinking about the job, sir. I'm thinking about the version of me that doesn't get to exist if that job disappears, because I don't know what else I'd be, and nobody's ever told me what else I could be. The silence after he finished was different from the earlier silences. This one was respectful. Margaret was crying quietly. She didn't try to hide it. She just dabbed her eyes with a tissue from her bag. Even some of the executives looked uncomfortable, not in a defensive way, in a human way. William let James's words sit for a long time. He wasn't rushing to fill the air. He was honoring it. Then finally he spoke. I want to propose something to this table. I've been thinking about it for some weeks now, and what I've heard today has only strengthened my conviction about it. I don't have the authority to enact policy. That's not my role, but I do have the ability to convene and the ability to suggest, and that's what I intend to do. He took a sip of water. I'd like to propose a framework. We can call it whatever we want, but for the moment, I've been calling it the skills bridge. The principle is simple. Every major automation deployment in this country, above a certain scale, would be required to fund a corresponding retraining and apprenticeship program, not run by a third-party contractor with a track record of overpromising, but co-designed by the workers affected, the companies deploying the technology, and the local communities involved. He turned to Charles Bennett. Mr. Bennett, your union has been advocating for something like this for years. Is that fair? 15 years, sir. We've been called naive every time. You're not naive. You were early. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Trenton, I'm not asking your company to stop automating. I am asking your company and others like it to recognize that the productivity gains from automation are not solely the property of shareholders. They are, in part, the dividend of generations of workers who built the industrial foundation on which your technology now sits. A reasonable portion of those gains should return to the communities that made them possible, not as charity, as partnership. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was thinking, really thinking. William turned to James. And James, I'd like to ask you something. If a program like this existed, where you and Margaret and Thomas were genuinely involved in designing what came next, not just retrained out of your job, but consulted about what your community actually needs, would you participate? James didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Why? Because nobody's ever asked, sir. Nobody's ever asked me what I think Sheffield needs. They've only ever told me. And I think Sheffield would be different if they had. William nodded slowly. He turned back to the table at large. That is what I want from this round table. Not a press release, not a photo, a genuine commitment from every party in this room, the companies, the government, the unions, the workers, to design what comes next together. Because if we don't, we will continue to produce technological miracles in this country that benefit a few and hollow out many. And history will, as Mr. Trenton rightly said, judge us for it. The minister cleared his throat. Your Royal Highness, this would obviously require significant policy work, but the government would be very open to. Good? William smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. Then let's begin. The round table went on for another hour after that, but the shape of it had changed. People who hadn't spoken began to speak. A woman from one of the smaller engineering firms in Rotherham described how her company had absorbed automation by retraining her existing workforce instead of replacing them. The minister stopped speaking in slogans and started asking actual questions. Dr. Sharma, the economist, broke into a small smile at one point and said quietly, "This is the first conversation about this I've been in that didn't feel like a funeral." Marcus Trenton, to his credit, did not leave the room. He didn't try to derail anything. He sat there, listening. Occasionally he made a note. Occasionally he asked a question. They weren't trick questions, they were real ones. I watched him do it, and I tried, for the first time, to imagine the version of him as a younger man before the suits and the watch and the magazine covers. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't quite the same villain he'd been when he walked in. Eventually William looked at the clock at the far end of the hall. We've been here 3 hours. I think it's time we close, before I exhaust everyone. A small ripple of laughter. Before we end, I want to do one more thing. I want to thank each of you individually for what you've contributed today. And he did. He went round the table, every single person by name. He thanked the executives for their honesty. He thanked the workers for their courage. He thanked the minister for his openness. He thanked Dr. Sharma for her clarity. He didn't read it off a sheet. He remembered all of it. He came to me last. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking a chance on James. Thank you for the suit. I know you don't wear it often. I started to laugh, and then realized he wasn't joking. He'd noticed, of course he'd noticed. And give my regards to your grandson. I will, sir. He'd not believe me anyway. Tell him I said his granddad was the bravest man at the table. I couldn't speak after that. Then finally, William turned to Marcus Trenton. The whole table waited. Mr. Trenton, Your Royal Highness. William paused. And then he said very gently, almost kindly, I noticed something today, and I don't want it to go unsaid. You checked your watch 7 times during this round table. Marcus blinked. I didn't realize I know. Most of us don't realize we do these things. I'm not raising it to embarrass you. I'm raising it because I want to ask you, honestly, and I'd genuinely like an answer. Were you checking it because you were eager to leave? Or were you checking it because you were eager to get back to work and start building something better? The room held its breath. Marcus Trenton looked at his watch, looked at William, looked at the table. And then for the first time all day, he gave an honest answer. I think, Your Royal Highness, I came in this morning checking it because I was eager to leave. He paused. I'm not sure when exactly that changed, but I'd like to think the next time I check it, it'll be for the other reason. William smiled. That's all any of us can ask, Mr. Trenton. Thank you, he stood. Everyone else stood with him. He shook hands with every person in the room on his way out, just as he had on his way in. Margaret, James, Charles, me, Marcus, And then he was gone. The hall slowly emptied. People hung around, talking in small groups, exchanging numbers. Margaret hugged James. Charles came over and clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well, Tom, you were there. You can tell your grandkids." I walked out alone. The Sheffield evening had turned cold. There was a fine drizzle in the air, the kind that doesn't seem to fall so much as just appear on your coat. I stood outside the converted mill for a moment, looking up at the brick chimneys that used to belong to my grandfather's world. I thought about what William had said, about not promising us that our jobs would survive. He hadn't lied to us. That was the strange thing. He hadn't promised what he couldn't deliver. He hadn't given us a fairy tale. He just made sure we were in the room. That was the whole thing in the end. He just made sure we were in the room. I started walking toward the bus stop. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Karen. "How did it go?" I stopped at the curb. The rain was coming down a little harder now, the street lights flickering on. I thought about James and his welds and his version of himself that might one day teach someone else. I thought about Margaret and the women she'd stood next to for 38 years. I thought about my grandfather in this same patch of Sheffield, doing the same work the same way for 41 years. I thought about a prince who had spent 6 months visiting factories without telling anyone. I typed back, something happened. "I'll tell you when I get home." And I walked into the rain, toward the bus, toward my wife, toward whatever Sheffield was going to be in the next 20 years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like there might be a we in deciding what that was. That, I thought, was a place to start.